Hi there, welcome to my video about hardware being the easy part with VR Labs. My name is Jill Ellern, and I want to talk to you a little bit about the hardware being the easy part and the rest of the gray areas. So let me first introduce myself. I'm the systems librarian at Western Carolina University. It's a mid-sized library in rural North Carolina. We've had a VR room for about 2 years, and it's part of our Scholar Studio that has a number of items, including the VR Lab. The VR Lab itself was purchased from a grant, and we purchased 4 high-end PCs, 2 Oculuses, 2 Rifts, and 1 PlayStation. I'm going to show you some pictures here in a minute, but we outfitted a whole room. We started in a temporary space and got funded and moved into a bigger. We also bought at the same time some items for checkout. Those are those items, although through use some of them have had to be removed because of use being loved to death. We now mostly use free software, although we have, just before COVID hit, we had finished purchasing a human anatomy piece of software, and that's the origami. Let me show you some pictures. This is the outside of the room. There's a door, it's lockable. Inside is a pretty good space where I've marked off the floor to give the guardian space. We have the 2 Rifts on one side and the Oculus is on the other, as you can see. Now let me tell you a little bit about what I'm going to talk about. I have 5 items. First I'm going to talk about the paradigm shift that librarians had to go through to get our VR into their library. I'll talk a little bit about the legal, health, and access issues. A little bit about the lab technology issues. There's a lot of those. The logistics of working with faculty is very interesting. And lastly, COVID-19, which has kind of put a damper into everybody's implementation of VR. So let's start at the beginning. VR is actually a paradigm shift, I would say, for librarians, where we're doing a little bit different stuff than we have before. It's part of the process that we've gone through to install maker spaces in the academic libraries. And it has been a shift in thinking from being a house that holds material to actually being a place where it's created. VR sits kind of in the middle of that. Things are created, and also you're using a lot more resources than you usually do for teaching and learning and that kind of thing. We do get talked about VR being a game room, but we've tried not to make that a primary idea in anybody's head. This is an educational space, although people do tend to think of it that way. When you get into VR, there's also some issues with turf space, whether it's really the EIT's section, what part of the library should be doing it. There's some level of interest because it takes quite a bit of staff time and training, and it's expensive. So there's some issues with making it pay for itself. There's also, we ran into some major optics about the fact that we were cutting serials but buying VR things. Like a lot of libraries that have been growing, we've hit that 10,000 student issue, and then the cost of a lot of serials went up, so we've had to cancel a lot, and just the general price of inflation going up. So there was some optics whether faculty were going to go talking to us about cutting some major subscriptions while at the same time buying VR stuff. So that took a while to get through as well. And lastly, it seems that VR tech is made mostly for individuals and not for institutions. And so the processes that are needed for institutions is very different when you're dealing with VR where you're not attaching it to a particular person or that computer is the only one that you have with it. And so some of our regular processes don't work. They can't cope with it. And so a lot of VR is about how comfortable you and your library are with these gray areas that haven't been completely explored, so we can figure out what to do about them. And I'm going to talk about those a lot as I go along. First step is the legal, health, and access issues, because we are talking about an organization and not individuals. And most of this stuff is geared towards the individual. So you have some legal declarations that you have to deal with and somebody has to approve. There's some health concerns and age concerns that are happening. Some public libraries are having some issues with this because the vendors don't really recommend people under 14 to use VR. There's some dizziness. I had to work through a lot of those things. I'll talk about that in a minute. There's some account issues because it's an individual, not an institution. Some of the account licensing doesn't take this into account. And you have to make some changes to the room, which, depending on your library, you may not have the rights to do. So let me talk about these gray areas. So first thing we did was we stopped with the lawyers to look at what legal ramifications we'd have to have a VR room. And we were the first on campus to do that. And so we took it to the lawyers, and it took a lot of back and forth. And I'll show you in a minute, we were not able to get some things out of there, even though they wanted, because the lawyers wanted things in there. Steam itself, which is one of the major vendors that sell software, does expect that a Steam account, they actually have those words, strictly personal accounts, which when I started asking around other libraries, they hemmed and hawed and said that's the only way to do it. So they were violating the licensing agreement, and there doesn't seem to be a choice if you want to get into VR. So it's a question of those gray areas and how comfortable you are with them. There's physical needs about the space. Can you change it? Can you mount things? Can you write on walls? What can you do? Those things you may or may not have access to, the physical plant may own. So those took a little bit of getting over as well. So let me show you some of what I did, and I have this to share with you later as well. But there's some health risks, and I'm not sure if you see it. I couldn't get them to remove perhaps even death, which seems crazy, but there it is. Some liability, some infringements, and some more liability that we had to put into our document before somebody could reserve a system and agree to. It's also on the outside of our room. I mentioned Steam. Steam actually says, i.e. strictly personal, and even some of the vendors that sell it to you directly as an educational require that you have a Steam account, and so you're violating the license. And you have to be okay with that if you want to continue forward. There really isn't any other solution. And so those are some of the first gray areas. Next, you have the lab and the technology management things, which include things like the room management, setting up scheduling, the accessories and how you're going to control those, especially if you don't have anybody in the room, what software you're going to use, how you're going to purchase it. We spent a lot of time very early looking at collection development policies if we did buy stuff, which, as I've been talking to other people, the question is, do you use that same collection development policy on things that are free? And how you can compare a collection development policy from use policies, which can be interactive and interact and hard to separate as you're trying to talk about it, but you have to keep your mind focused on what's the collection of things you purchase versus how you're going to use the room. And lastly, are you going to require people to have training before they use the room or the PC? How are you going to track those uses? Which leads me to the second gray area, which is a lot of use things and labs things, like, are you going to lock down the computers? It's really not viable to do that because the software updates almost every day. It's hard to lock down accounts so people can't load software, especially if that's free and not purchased, so that there's no credit card in there. Because the systems are allowed to share between, to take your system and go to somebody else's house. You can then load and share software while you're at your buddy's house. So students were doing some of that. And how do you control all that when you don't have any staff in the room? How do you control how old the people are if their faculty bring in their kid? Do you throw them out? How do you deal with that? And how do you count use? Do you count all the people that are sitting around watching? And how do you count that? And how do you do that, again, if you're not completely staffed and locking it up? And so all of those are gray areas that you have to negotiate and figure out what you're going to do. The next thing is the logistics of using VR with faculty. Now, faculty are enthusiastic about this. That's great. We want to teach. They want to show it. But what software and what experience do you want? And does the faculty have some particular learning objectives in mind, or do they just want to look at stuff? And most folks think they can just walk in and start using it, and there really is a learning curve to learning how to deal in VR space for a faculty member and even a student, and how the logistic of using one system for one person while a lot of people are sitting around, and how many you should have that, are all things that you have to negotiate with the faculty. And that leads me to my third gray area, which is you really need to catch your faculty before they bring in their class, to let them think about, to know what the system is and what it can and can't do, have an idea of what they want to do, and ask them what they want to accomplish. They think that students are really savvy, and that's not, I've found in my experience, is not true. There's some peer pressure going on, where somebody's in the system and what people are looking at. There's some dizziness issues and some learning curves, and each group is different about how many work together in a group. You also are working with the faculty to figure out that marketing and justification of it. So you want to have them there, but you don't want them to have a bad experience. So it's a tough thing. So what I do is I usually have an appointment with faculty beforehand, and I send them this document. I will share this with you as well. That gives them a little heads up on how they go about thinking about using the VR space in the beginning. Because what we're looking for are champions. I would say they're looking for faculty to cultivate that get VR, that have the time, the interest, and the skills, and have a project in mind. And so they can market and use it so that it creates more interest and it snowballs. That's what we're looking for, and you have to go through a lot of faculty to figure that out. There's some I've seen only once, and some I've seen faculty and students that I've seen multiple times. And you never know which one of those it's going to be. So you continually do training and demos and marketing through that process. And lastly, COVID, which has closed our room right now to the patrons. We've been looking at CleanBox. I've taken the VR station home, and I've been working with some faculty with Oregon to be the hands while they make videos of it. I've been researching these gray areas, and I soon will have an article out. And part of that process, I came up with a resource kit to share with faculty that are working on libraries and that type, that are looking at budgeting, collection development, things I wish I had when I started out. And so I want to share that with you. So that's my presentation, and I'm ready for questions.